Okay, this is part 2 where we're going to continue with the introduction to Unity by taking what we've done here and making it into a tank game using a tank game tutorial by Microsoft. So the tutorial is actually in your Canvas links, and it is making games with C# and Unity, beginner's tutorial. They're no longer really supporting this tutorial. It's only a couple of years old, but it's still accurate. But I'm going to take you through it to make it easy. We've downloaded all of the resources in the package that you added to your Unity project in the last video that I showed, and we're going to use the scripts that are also from this tutorial as well. So there's quite a few scripts here. They have you type these out in the tutorial. I've actually provided these so that, but I'm going to explain them, what each one of them means. So first of all, let's take a look at what we did in the last video. If I hit play here, I have my character controller. I can move around, and I'm going to shoot, and I can shoot this sphere projectile that is colliding with the cubes or bricks and knocking them around with the physics in the engine. So I want to use some of that, but we're not going to use exactly this. We're going to be adding other things that were imported with the starter pack. So there's some prefabs here that we're going to use, and then there's some scripts that we're going to use. And that's pretty much it. The rest of it will build inside of the 3D hierarchy here. Now we can start actually working with this a little bit by just replacing the projectile. Right now we have this sort of pink colored metallic looking projectile that I'm shooting out of my camera on my FPS controller. So what we can do is we can replace that with this missile that we're going to use in the tank game tutorial. And in the tutorial, they have you set that up anyway. So let's go ahead and set it up, and we'll try it out on the FPS controller first. So we have this prefab, and I'll click on it. And it's basically just a missile model. So we'll start with this prefab object right here, and we've got on this object a transform, a missile, mesh render, and a material. But what we really want to look at is what's in the prefab itself. So a prefab is, as I mentioned in the last video, a master object. And in this case, if you want to look at what's all in this object, then you've got to open up the prefab so that we can look at it, and we can also see it over here in our 3D view in a sort of an isolated way. And now I'm working directly with that master object. And what I need to shoot this object is, if I look at it, it has no collider on it, and it has no physics, no rigid body physics. So I need some physics components on this. And I'm going to start by going to add component, and I'm going to go to the physics area. And the first thing I need is a collider. Well, this object is not really a cube or anything like that, so I'm not going to use a box collider. I'm going to use probably the capsule collider. The capsule collider is going to give me a shape that will fit around this a little better. And the thing with the capsule collider is that it has a length to it, and it's called height and then a radius. And so if I pull the height up on this, you'll see that the capsule collider right now, and I'll pull the radius down, is kind of going vertically when my missile's going horizontally. So I actually want to change this, and I could go to my move tool to see which axis is actually going down the length of this missile, and it's the positive Z axis. So I want to change the direction of this capsule collider to the Z axis. And I'm going to choose that, and now you can see that it fits around the missile a lot better. And I can adjust that radius down a little bit more. I don't really have to have colliders for the fins. And really, if you think about it, the missile is going to collide in the front part here. And it's better actually if I scale the height down to not just leave it coming across the whole thing, because when this gets instantiated, it's going to come out of, in this case, the camera or the tank that we're going to do in a little while, and it might actually collide with the object it's coming out of if I make this collider too big, and then it would explode right there at the very time that it gets spawned or instantiated. So I'm going to make that collider a little smaller, and I'm going to move it towards the front. Now you don't do that up here with the move tools. You do that with your components in here. There's a center for this collider, and the direction we're working with here is Z. So I want to move it along the Z axis. And again, I have this virtual slider, which if I click on the Z with my left mouse button and I slide it or move it to the right, it's going to move it to the right and place it kind of at the front of my missile. And that's where I would want it to impact something and trigger the explosion. So I'm going to put it up there, and that way I don't have to worry about that colliding with anything in the back part of the missile here. And that ended up being about 0.57 in Z. So yours doesn't have to be with the exact same thing as these numbers. It's just that you can just interactively do it here on the component. And then the other thing I need here is I need to go to Add Component Physics again, and I need to add the rigid body, because the rigid body is what's going to allow me to actually shoot it, just like I did with the projectile sphere. So in this case, I don't really need to do anything else with this. The mass is not going to make that much of a difference. I don't think on this one. I can always adjust it later, so I'm just going to leave it at the defaults. And then one other thing is that this object is going to explode, and the explosion is going to happen from a script. And the script is actually going to be placed on this object. So I'm going to go, the script that I'm talking about, if I go to Add Component Scripts, the scripts that I gave you for the tank game has a script in it that is called Missile Explosion. And you want to add that to the missile itself. So we've just added that to the missile itself. And you'll notice that what it has, it has an explosion prefab. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that explosion prefab over into that space. So I have that in my prefabs. It's called explosion. It looks like a blue cube. And I'm going to grab it. It's looking for a game object, and I'll just drag it onto where it says prefab. All right, so that should be enough for me to test this out and see what else I might need on it. So let's do that. Let's test it out. So I'm going to go out of my prefab here. Right now I'm in the missile prefab over in my hierarchy area, and that shows me the missile in my 3D view. There's the name missile, and then to the right of that there's a little arrow. I'm going to click on that to go back out to my regular hierarchy. And then now that I have all this stuff on the missile prefab, I'm going to want to shoot that out of my camera. So I'm going to go to my first person controller, and the child to that is the camera of the first person controller. And I want to go down until I find the shooter script that I put on here. And I'm using the other projectile, and where it says my projectile, I'm just going to drag the missile into there. And I'm going to leave the fire sound there, and I'll go ahead and try it out. So let's hit play. And we can hear our controller, and we'll go ahead and try firing a missile. Okay, so I saw that an explosion, and I didn't hear the explosion, so we're going to have to add an explosion sound, but I did see the explosion. And so it's coming out of the camera, and this is a problem because that camera is actually inside. If I zoom in on my FPS controller, that camera is actually inside of the collider for this FPS controller. So it immediately hit that collider and it exploded without even going anywhere. So what I need to do is I need to add a launcher object for this. So I'm going to go ahead and create another empty. And the empty, as I showed you last time, is just a center. And I'm going to name it launcher over in my inspector. And I'm going to make it child to the FPS camera, the first person character object on the FPS controller, which is where the camera is. So I just dragged it with the left mouse button over in my hierarchy area on top of this first person character. You just drag it with your left mouse button. And if it's child to it, it will be indented in, and you'll get the little arrows on, or the arrow on the first person character object, which can be opened up and you can see the launcher object. And then the launcher object, I'm going to just reset its transforms, so that it pops right on top of that camera, and it will be oriented exactly the same as that camera. Because children always take the transforms of the parent object. It becomes their world center, and its relative, it's world center relative to this launcher object. And so, so when I zero out or reset it, it goes to the same orientation and position as the parent. And then I can just have that launcher object selected, and I'll just move it in Z, which is that blue axis. Make sure you're in local mode, is that blue axis, and that's going to be where the camera's looking at. So I'm just going to drag that move tool to move that out a little bit in front of where the camera is. Now, if I go back to the FPS controller and look at where the launcher is, it should be a little bit out in front of it now. So that's where I want it to spawn the missile object. And then what I have to do is just remove the component from the camera object itself. You can't copy it over really, so you just got to remove it. So I'm just going to find the shooter script inside of the FPS controller, and I'm going to click on the cog icon and remove that component. That's where you remove components. And then I'm going to go to the launcher object, and I'm going to add component scripts, and I'm going to choose the shooter script. And then I can plug the missile in by dragging it onto where it says my projectile. And I can go to my sounds folder and drag with the left mouse button the fire audio clip onto where it says shoot sound. And then I can try it again. So I've got those two things plugged in, and I want to try it another time here. So I'll go ahead and do that. I'll hit play, and I'll move around a little bit, and I'll click, and I saw it launch the missile, and it really exploded that because I put the explosion script on it, and it actually has some force to it. So it really obliterated that brick wall there. But I am getting an error message that it says there's no audio source attached to that launcher object. So again, if you see a red error on the bottom of your Unity, that's where the command console puts error messages, and if you click on it, it will open that console and you can read it more clearly. But it pretty clearly states here that the audio source is missing from the launcher game object, and the script is trying to access it. So that's why we didn't hear anything when I shot it. I forgot to add an audio source, so I'll click on Add Component, Audio, and add the audio source to it. And again, it's getting played from the script, so I don't have to plug anything in, but I do need that to actually be able to shoot and hear some kind of shooting sound. So it is working, and let's take a look at a couple of those other components because they're not really working yet, and I want to make sure they're working as well. So the explosion itself, let's take a look at what's inside the explosion. So the explosion is a prefab in my prefabs folder. And I'll go ahead, since I've started building the tank game, I'm going to do a save as, and we'll save into our scenes folder. And we've been saving intro demo 1. Let's go ahead and do the, we'll start doing the tank game. So I'll put tank game 1 and save that. So I want to select the explosion, and you can see there's not much here. It just looks like a transform, but actually if you open the prefab, you'll see that there's a lot of stuff over here. Actually, there's some particles being generated here. So there's a shock wave, smoke black, and all of these different particle effects that are inside the explosion prefab are being spawned at the same time to give the effect of an explosion. But what it doesn't have that you can see here is it doesn't have any kind of sound. So when the explosion is spawned, we would like to hear some kind of explosion sound to go with that. So I'm going to add a component, and we were playing sounds through the script, but we can also play a sound through the audio component itself. So if I go to audio and add an audio source here, then I can go to my sounds folder and find the explosion sound and just plug it in to the audio clip. Now this will play on awake. It's turned on right here to play on awake. So that means that it will automatically play the explosion sound when the explosion is spawned. And the explosion script will delete the explosion afterwards, so that should keep it from playing again. So let's just try that and see if we get an explosion sound. Now that we've added that to our prefab, we'll go back out of there again. And we want to go ahead and try shooting again and see if we get something that has more of an explosion sound. So if I click my left mouse button to shoot, now I have an explosion sound. Okay, so that's working. We'll want that for the tank game. Now that we've created a missile shooting out of our first-person controller and getting an explosion effect, we'll go ahead and move on to the tank game tutorial that is referenced in the syllabus. So that tutorial, Making Games with C# and Unity, Beginner's Tutorial, is a 3D version of the classic tank game that is 2D, classic arcade type of game. And in this case, they give you prefabs with models and the explosion and things that we've already used. And they start off with creating a plane and bringing in the tank prefabs to add components to them and some of the scripts. And then they get into the firing of the missiles. So we've kind of skipped into the firing of the missiles part, and we'll go ahead and go back and do some of the other stuff. Now, we don't have to discard what we've already done. We can use this wall, for instance, as part of our tank game if we want to. And so if I have these bricks here, I can collapse them down into my 3 sets of bricks. And then if I want to place it, it might be easier actually if I go ahead and create an empty and call it wall in the inspector, and then take that empty, reset it so it's going to be right back in the middle of the world space, and then move it so that maybe it's right in the middle of my wall. And then to make it the parent of all the different wall pieces, I can just shift select, select the first bricks, hold the shift down and select the last brick empties that have all the bricks child to them, and left mouse button drag it onto that wall object so that it parents it under the wall and it's indented in so we can see it's parented. And then we can move that wall or rotate it anywhere we want from this empty. And we can just collapse that down. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in the tank, and we'll resize also the ground plane as well. Maybe we'll just zoom out a little bit. And we will need to, we're not going to want our FPS controller in the tank game. So I don't have to delete the FPS controller because we might want to use it again later on. What I could do is just select the FPS controller and turn it off at the very top of the inspector right next to the name. I can just turn that little checkbox off. Now you can see that it says that there's no camera anymore. So in that case, I need to go to the Create menu and find Camera at the very bottom and create a new camera. And this camera, I'll go ahead and reset it so it's placed sort of at the center of the world. But I really want it, I'll go ahead and move it up here. I want it to be facing downwards. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate that camera. I'll put the rotate tool on and let's orbit around, and we'll rotate it down in X so it's kind of looking down towards that center wall. And then I'll go ahead and zoom out a little bit in my 3D view, and I want to switch to my move tool, and grab the blue arrow, which is where the camera is looking at right now, and just drag it straight back to zoom out and get it so that I can see the entire field in my game view. My game view is using free aspect. You can see on the top of the window, it says free aspect. And you might want to go ahead and set it to something that is kind of more of a standard screen size. So you can see I've got 1920 by 1080 plugged in here. You have these sort of standalone ones here like 16:9. But you could set it exactly to a certain number of pixels by clicking the little plus sign and then typing in a label and putting in your width and height in pixels. And that's what I did with this 1920 by 1080, and that sets it to pretty much the same as 16:9 anyway. So this gives me a particular size game view. So if I want to make sure that I can see it with what I think is going to be the end aspect ratio of the game, then I could go ahead and set that now. And then I would want to put my tanks on either side of this wall and maybe actually select the ground plane and scale it out a little bit. So the scaling tool is this one with the square and the arrows coming out of it. And in this case, I'd want to scale it out in X to maybe fill up more of the screen, like so. And we'll work a little bit more on the field in a little while, but let's go ahead and bring a tank in. So we're going to place a tank on one side of this wall, and that's in our prefabs folder. And you can see that's where the tank is. And what we want to do with the tank is go ahead and just drag the prefab into your scene and place it on one side of your wall. It will automatically sort of place itself on the plane, and we'll go ahead and leave it the way it is. I can double click it and we'll zoom into it, and we can see what it looks like, and we can look at the contents, the components in the inspector. Now those components have a transform. We got a mesh renderer, and there's a material on it called Player One. And so we might want to add some things to it. Well, in the tutorial, you're going to add stuff to it. And the first thing that you'd want to add, of course, is going to be some kind of collider, because it doesn't have it on there right now. So you could do this on the object that you made, but it would actually be better for you to select the tank object itself in the prefabs folder, go to the very top, and open the prefab. So that way I'm working on the master object, and it will automatically go on the child object out here in the scene. If I work on the child object, it's an instance, and it won't go on the prefab. So when we want to create our second tank, we won't necessarily have all the things on it if we don't work in the prefab. So I'm going to open the prefab, and now we're inside of the prefab. You can see that it's just the tank showing up in my 3D view. And I'll go ahead and add my components there. So I'm going to go to Add Component, and the first one I add is Physics, and I'm going to use a box collider. You could use something else like a mesh collider, which would actually use the mesh, but we really don't need that for a simple game like this. I don't need it to recognize that my tank has an unusual non-uniform shape. So I'm going to just add the box collider. You actually get to see then what a box collider looks like. It looks like a green wireframe cube that surrounds the volume of that tank. And That's fine for what we need. If the tank is going to get hit by a missile, then that's what we want it to recognize. And if it hits the other tank, bangs into it, then it should look fairly realistic. It doesn't have to be super realistic for this kind of a video game. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that box collider there. And the other thing that I'm going to need, I don't want to put gravity on this because actually, sorry, I do want to put gravity on it. So we do need rigid body physics on this object. So I'm going to go ahead and go to add component again and physics, and we're going to add the rigid body to it, just like we've done before. So we've got our box collider and our rigid body, and that will allow the tanks to react to the missiles when they hit it and explode. It's going to have an effect on the tanks. And we'll go ahead and leave the defaults for now of the mass as it is. So with those two things on there, if I go back out and check the actual tank, you should see those two things on that tank. So they're on the master object, so they're going to automatically go on the child object. Now there is something else I want to add, so I'm going to go back to the master object again. I'm going to open the prefab. And what I want to add is some scripts. So the first script that they add in the tutorial is the player movement script. And the player movement script, we'll go ahead and add that to it as a component, scripts, and we'll find player movement. And that script has some inputs here. The main thing is that there's a player number, which is going to be 1 or 2, and then there's a speed and a rotation speed. And those, I don't have to actually drag anything into them. Those are just values that I can change if I want to after I test it out. So to test this out, we'll go back out to the hierarchy, and we want to test out the movement of this tank. So I'll go ahead and hit play, and if I press the W key, I should see the tank move forward, and if I press the S key, it goes backwards. A will turn it to the left, and D will turn it to the right. So WASD, you can maneuver your tank around just like the classic tank game. And you'll see that if I were to back up here into the wall, it will run into the wall and explode the wall there. So all of those are working. The WASD keys are working. I haven't added any kind of shooting mechanism or the missile or anything like that to this tank yet. That's the next thing that I would want to do. So we'll go ahead and keep working on this one tank, and then when we get it the way we want it, we'll duplicate it to make the second tank. And so the next thing, I'm going to go ahead and save this. The next thing I want to do is I want to go into the prefabs folder and back to the tank prefab, open it up, and I want to add another script. Now we are going to look at these scripts. Actually, we can look at them as we go along here. So if I go to the scripts folder, we just added the player movement script. So let's right click that and open that script and take a look at it. So the player movement script It has all the standard using statements in the first three lines. And then it's got a public class, player movement. And then we have listed several public variables and a private variable before the start function. And in this case, first we have public int player number equals 1. So it's setting that player number field to 1 to begin with, and it's setting the speed field. It's a float, so int on a variable is a whole number. And in this case, player 1, player 2, you don't ever have any decimals, so you're going to use an integer. And float is a decimal number. That's something if you want to plug something in that is potentially going to have a decimal in it. And you do need to put the F letter after the number if you're assigning it like this. When you see a semicolon at the end of every line in a C# script, that's a terminator. And that ends that line. And every line is going to have a terminator, except ones that are sort of setting up a procedure or method or function. In this case, the start function, your parentheses don't have anything after them, and the curly brackets don't either, and neither do you don't have that on the class either. But every line inside of that is going to have a terminator at the end of the lines. And the private one that we have here, the private variable, that's a rigid body that's going to reference the body of this tank object. So if it's private like this, then that means you're going to have something that gets the components of that object and puts it into this rigid body variable. You know it's going to be a rigid body because that's the type of variable that it's creating for it. And that's happening in the start, just like we had with the other script where it was looking for an audio and it got get component audio source. This one is getting the component of a rigid body that this script is on. So this script has to be on a rigid body in order for it to get this component. And otherwise you would get an error message. So this script is placed on the tank. So it is a rigid body. We added the rigid body to it. It's going to put that in there, and then it's going to use that to do the movement. So in update, it's going to be looking for some kind of input from the keyboard to make the tank move. And you see that there is a movement input float that is actually running a procedure called get movement input. Now, if you see parentheses after a name like this, then you know that you're working with some kind of procedure. So if I go down, there's got to be a get movement input somewhere in here. And so I can see that that's actually after my update. So we have a start, we have update, and then you traditionally put your custom procedures after those two sort of built-in procedures that come with creating a C# script in Unity. And so the first one here is the get movement input procedure, and it's actually sending out something. So it doesn't say void, it says float, which means the output of this procedure is a float number, a decimal number. And that's what it's catching right here. And it's catching it into a float variable. So if we look at that, what's happening, get movement input, that's where it's actually using a key code command, and it's part of the Unity engine. You can hover over it in Visual Studio. It'll say a little bit about it. But we're getting the positive key and the negative key and we're looking at player number 1, and we're looking at the W and S keys. It can also be the up arrow and down arrow keys. So there's a couple of things in here. And then it's saying if input get key is the positive key, then return 1, which means, or a float of 1. And return is sending out a value. And if it's the negative key, then return a value of -1. Otherwise, it's not returning anything. It's 0. This is just going to put positive or negative numbers into the script from whatever keys you're pressing. And that's going to be used to move the transforms, either move it forward and backwards. In this case, it's the W and S, so it's definitely, or the up arrow and down arrow, so it's definitely the position that it's putting numbers into. So here you can see that happening. It's going to get a transform forward. It's multiplying that by the movement input and the speed, and with something called time.delta time, which is actually numbers from the game loop coming in. And that's propelling this forward at a certain speed. And forward is positive Z inside. Forward gets translated. Transform.forward gets translated to positive Z inside of Unity. Body.move position, and it's taking the position and then it's adding the movement. So this is where it's actually doing the movement. And the body.move position is part of the rigid body, because that's what body is. It's a rigid body component. So that dot syntax is moving it forward. It's putting numbers into the move position. And then the rotation input is from get rotation input. Again, that's a procedure because it's got parentheses, and that's got to be down here somewhere. And it's pretty much doing the same thing, only it's different keys. In this case, it's the DNA key, and you're getting positive numbers for one of them and negative numbers for the other. So that's being plugged in up here. That's being put into a float rotation input, and that's again being multiplied by the rotation speed and time.delta time. That's putting it into degrees to turn, another float variable, and that's putting it in actually into the rotation as a quaternion Euler. And then right here, this line, body.move rotation, is actually what's rotating the tank. So there's a lot of translations that are going on there. That has to do with numbers being translated to rotation degrees so that it's going to all come out correctly. And that's pretty much the entire script there. So if we go back in to the Unity game engine, that tells us what's going on when I hit play and I'm using my WASD keys to move this tank around. Positive numbers, negative numbers, positive forward, negative backward, coming in from the keyboard. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next script that I want to add. And the next thing that I'm still inside of this prefab, and I want to add the same kind of thing that I did with the shooting mechanic out of the first-person controller. I want to create an empty that I'm going to make child to the tank. So we'll go ahead and select the tank here. And we have our tank object. And I'm going to go ahead and create an empty for it. And actually, yeah, okay, let's do that. I'm going to create an empty, and it made it child to it, and let's just call it launcher again, or let's call it tank launcher. You can have the same name if they're child to different objects, but we'll just give it a unique name, tank launcher. And that's going to be the object that I want to plug into a script that I want to put on the main tank object here. So I had the tank object selected. It automatically made it child to it when I created the empty. And that's a nice thing that I don't have to drag it on there. But it's not in the right place. I mean, if I do grab that, you can see it made it. It's 0, 0, 0. So it made it directly inside of that tank, and where I need to move it up a little bit, maybe orbit around so I can kind of see where that is and why, and then move it out so it's going to be out beyond, right in front of the tank turret here, and kind of centered there. And it's going to spawn it right where that is, and since the missile has a little length to it, if you don't want it to actually come through the tank turret, you might want to move it a little bit out in front of it so that it's not going to actually look like it's inside of there. It's going to happen very fast, so you might not even notice, but I'll move it a little bit out. And then what I want to go back to is the tank itself, and go ahead and add on another script. And the script that I want to use this time is going to be the missile gun script. So I'll go ahead and use the missile gun script and add that to it. The missile gun script is going to have a couple of fields that I need to drag some game objects into. One's a game object, one's just a transform. So transform is really just that empty that I made. And that's how it's going to know what to shoot it out of. So I'm going to drag this tank launcher that I made with my left mouse button where it says fire transform. And the tank launcher is going to go in there. And that way it'll know to spawn the missile where that empty is. And then the missile prefab, I just got to tell it what do I want to spawn, and it's the missile that we made earlier that we already put the collider on it and the rigid body, and we also added the explosion script. So I'm going to go ahead and drag that onto the missile prefab. So now we've got a missile gun script and it's got everything loaded into it. Let's go back out again, or let's go ahead and try this. So I'll hit play, and if I move the tank and let's rotate it towards the wall, and let's go ahead and we'll hit control and shoot. And you can see that it knocked the entire wall out of there. Now I can click the left mouse button or I can hit the left control button. Those are both set to do the firing mechanism. And I'll show you where that's set inside of Unity, because we are going to have to edit that a little bit. So if we go look at the script that is being used to do that firing, we'll go and open up the missile gun script. You're going to see that it's similar actually to the shooter script that we used earlier, but the shooter script is a little more simple. than this missile gun script. And it's got a few comments there. And then the first variables that are in this missile gun script is the player number. And we're going to change that for player 2, but player 1 is what we're working on right now. So we leave it. That's the default. It's looking for a public game object for the missile prefab, and that's what we plugged in. Again, public, it shows up in the inspector, a transform, the fire transform, that's what's going to spawn the missile. And then the fire force is a public float that you could change if you didn't want the missile to fire as strongly as this. You could make it a smaller number, or you could make it a larger number. So there's nothing in the start on this one, and the update is very, very similar to what we saw in the shooter script. It's an if statement, and it's looking whether we get button down, fire plus player number. So it's in the other script, the shooter script, which I have right here. It's got plugged into the get button up. It's a similar command, input get button up, but the other one's using get button down. But fire 1 is listed specifically, and that means something inside of Unity. It means the left mouse button or the left control for fire 1. Well, we're gonna need both fire 1 and fire 2. So we can't just hard code that in there, or it would only work for fire 1. We want it to be able to use fire 2 if the player number changes to 2. So in that case, you have to add the number to the text. And this text here is leaving off the number part so that we can add it with the variable. So this player number is translated to a 1 or 2 depending on what is put in up here at the top. And if it's 1, it's going to be translated 1, and it's going to be appended to the word fire. So you've got if input get button down fire 1, and then it's going to run these commands, which are instantiating a missile, just like we did, in position and rotation of whatever object this is being instantiated from. In this case, it's the launcher object, the empty, and then it's going to get the rigid body components from that object, whatever was instantiated. It's going to extract the rigid body components, and then it's going to shoot it forward in positive Z and multiply that by the fire force. So very, very similar to the other script. Some variations here. We were actually using velocity in the other script and multiplying that by shoot speed, but the other one is doing something very, very similar. Instead, though, it's using add force. So this script is propelling it forward, and let's look and see inside of Unity where that is being assigned. So if you go to edit inside of Unity and you go look into your project settings, there is an area in there, it's the fourth one down, called input. And it may look like there's nothing there, but you have to open it up because there's an arrow, and that means it's collapsed. And these are the built-in inputs to Unity. And you can see one of them is Fire 1. And if you open that up, you can see that the name is Fire 1. And what it is controlling for positive is the left control button. and what it's an alt positive input is mouse 0, and that's the left mouse button. So the rest of this you don't really have to worry about. It's really meant to have an input from the left mouse button and the left control button. Now, Fire 2 is what we're also using in the script, and if you open that up and look, you'll see that it's actually set to left alt. And for this, it makes more sense to make Fire 2 be set to right control. So if you're doing a two-player game, you want one of the tanks to be controlled by, say, WASD, and the other tank needs to be controlled by some other keys. So we're going to make it controlled by the arrow keys. And you kind of saw that in the other script that it was also referencing the arrow keys. And for player 2, we want to have the Fire reference or Fire 2 reference to go to something similar to what is on player 1. And so if there's a left control, there's definitely a right control, and you'd write it the same way, lowercase, left space CTRL, all lowercase, and that's going to make the left control button. And you can see already that mouse 1 is being used for the other tank. So mouse 1 is actually your right mouse button. So we've got left mouse button for Fire 1 and left control, and then we've got, we actually want right control, RIGHT, right control, and mouse 1 for Fire 2. And you just type those in, and you can see that there's other ones down here for jumping, which is your space bar, and you can see it's set to the space bar. You can change these and have it set to other things, and if you just close that, it will automatically save it. So when we make our other tank and we plug in that it's player 2, then it should automatically use other parts of the keyboard to control that. Okay, so that gives us a tank that can both move and shoot. I think that's all we really need for the tank part. So I'll go back out of the prefab, and we'll go ahead and drag another tank in. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go to the prefabs folder, and we'll just orbit a little bit. And I want to drag another tank onto the other side of the wall. And you can see that these tanks are using materials that are the same. So it's player 1 material. We do have a player 2 material, and I can go into the materials folder and drag that onto the player 2 tank so that it's going to be red. And then what we need to do is in the tank, in the hierarchy, in the components of this new tank, we will name this second tank. Actually, let's just name it tank player 2, no spaces. And then I'll name the other one tank player 1, just so it's clear. And then on player 2, I want to go down towards the bottom where the scripts are, and I want to make sure that I change the default player number 1 to 2 for both the player movement and missile gun. And then we'll go ahead and hit play, and I want to see if the WASD works, and if I hit control it should shoot, and if I do the arrows I should see the red tank move and rotate, and I should be able to shoot with the right control. Okay, so I'm shooting, but I'm noticing a problem here. If I do control again, I see there's no firing sound. And let's try the same thing with the other tank. We'll go ahead and rotate it and hit left control, and we can see that there is an explosion sound, but there's no fire sound. So the problem, I didn't get an error message, but it looks like I forgot to add an audio source for where the tank was firing from. Actually, so what we want to do is, what they do in the tutorial is they use the same method that they used for adding the sound to the explosion. And that is to add it to the prefab of the missile itself. So the missile itself, if I open that prefab up, it doesn't have any audio source right now. And so when it spawns, every time you shoot, it spawns a new one. We'll go ahead and add component audio source, and we'll plug in the sound for firing. So this is a little different than I did with the shooter script, where I actually put the firing sound on the shooter mechanic itself and played it through the script. In this case, I'm actually adding it to the missile that will play automatically when that missile is spawned. It's kind of very similar to what happens with the explosion. So if I play again and I hit the left control, now we hear a shooting sound. And we didn't hear an explosion because I think I just shot it right off the off screen. So I'll go ahead and do it again. And there we go, it's working. And we'll check the other one. So if I now shoot that way with the right control, yeah, it's working in both cases. So all of that is working. The mechanisms for making the tanks both move and shoot are there. And then what I want to do is I want to add some health and scoring. So we looked at the shooter script. There are other scripts in the scripts folder. There's a couple of other ones that I definitely want to add and that I gave you. One of them is a health script, and the other one's a score manager. So I'm going to go ahead and open the health script so we can look at it. The health script, it tells you that this is going to update the health of each player, and it's going to go on the tank object itself. And if we go look at it, again, you're going to set a player number, and you're going to do that in a public variable. You also have an integer for a start health, and it's starting at 5. So the health is actually going to be something that counts down as you're hit by your opponent. It's going to start at 5 and it's going to go down to 0. And so you can see we're assigning 5 to it. And then there's a current health that needs to be tracked. And that's a private. That's not something that you're going to see inside of the inspector. That's a private variable. And then you also have a score manager that you're going to have to reference, that being in another script. So that's also private, and then you have a public audio clip for a lose sound that we'll have to plug in. In the start, you can see that the current health is being equated, or not equated, but assigned to the start health, which is 5. So it's going to start with 5. And then it does a find object of type score manager. So it's actually looking for the score manager script. And then it's going to bring in, using this dot syntax down here, we're not even using update, but take damage is going to continuously be checked whenever you get hit, you're going to take damage. So that's going to happen whenever the health is being calculated. So in this case, your current health is being subtracted. So whenever you have a variable minus minus, that means -1. That's a shortcut for -1. So when take damage is a procedure, and it's actually not being run here at all. So it's being declared here, but it's not being run here. So it's going to be run in another script, and when it's run, it's going to subtract from the current health, and then it's going to update the score manager for whatever player number this is. And if that current health gets down to less than or equal to 0, then it's going to run the die procedure. And the die procedure plays the lose sound, gets the audio source component. So we're going to need to have an audio source on the object that this is on. It's going to play it once, play one shot, and it's the lose sound. And then the destroy command is going to just delete the game object from the game, and that destroy command has a timer in it, and in this case it's going to wait 2 seconds before it actually deletes it. And that's so that it has time to actually run the lose sound before the object actually disappears. So this object is going to go on the tank. We'll go ahead and that's why the tank, when it gets destroyed, is going to disappear when the destroy command runs. We'll go ahead and add that to it. So I'm going to go back in, and I'm going to go find the tank prefab, and I'm going to go ahead and add this other script there. Add component, scripts, and I'm going to go find the health script and add it. So once I add that health script, I do need to make sure that I plug in the audio, the sound for it, and that's going to be the game over sound, into the lose sound field. So there's where our start health is. It's starting at 5. There's a space for setting your player number. Since I did this on the prefab, it should go to all the actual tanks in here. I might have to reset tank 2's number values, because when you add something to it, sometimes it resets some of the other components. So I have to go check those here in a second. In fact, let's go check those now. So if I click on tank player 1, I can see that health script is there and everything looks good. It did not change anything, so nothing got taken out. And if I go to player 2, let's check it. Yes, okay, there's still player 2, so I'll go ahead and plug this player 2 in as well. So now we should have some health on there. And there's one other script that I want to go ahead and look at now, and that's the score manager. I'm going to open that up. And the score manager is going to have all the stuff in it that is going to be keeping track of a score that we're going to have in some text. And this script is actually going to be on what's called a canvas object, and it's using something extra up at the top here. It's using the UnityEngine.ui. And so we do want to keep score on this object. This type of a game would have a score for player 1, a score for player 2. And so let's go ahead and add that there before we test the health. And then we'll go back and look at some of the other things in the scripts too. So to add this last component into the game, I need to create in the hierarchy, under the UI section, I'm going to create some text. And that text is going to be what I use for doing the score. So I can just call it, I don't remember what they called it in the tutorial, but I'm going to just put score. We'll just call it that. Keep it simple. Actually, sorry, we need to keep track of both player 1 and player 2 scores. So let's put player 1 score, and then we're going to make a player 2 score. I'm not going to make it yet because I need to actually adjust this and make this look good before I duplicate it to create a player 2 score. So I can't see any text in my game view, and I should actually be able to see text when I create it. So you want to have the text start off in the center of your game view. And to do that, when you create a text object, it's under a special thing called Canvas, which is the graphical user interface for Unity. And that is a different space. It's a 2D screen space instead of the 3D world space that we have up here. It's flat. And it actually, if we reset under the cog icon this player 1 score and place everything back at 0, 0, 0, there is a Z position, but it's not really going to be used much. It's for layering things in Z space so that 2D components can kind of be on top of each other. But we're going to be only using the position X and Y for these. And the reason I don't see it in the center of my screen when I set these to 0, 0 is because of the color of the text and the size of the text. It's too small and it's black, and so even though it's probably there, I can't actually see it. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go down and I'm going to set it to white and close it. So you got a color swatch, just click into it, and then I start to actually see it there, and I can see some really little text. So now I'm going to go and change the font size to maybe like 60. And I see a couple of letters, but they're getting cut off. So you need to change on your paragraph area. You want to change a couple of things. First of all, change horizontal overflow to overflow instead of wrap. and then also vertical overflow, put that on as well. And then your full text will show up. Sometimes it gets cut off, and that's when it's set on wrap. So we're putting it on overflow. And then the text that's being placed in here is up here in this text field. I'm going to go ahead and change that, and I'm going to put a number. And I'm just going to put a starting number of 0. And so I want those zeros to be larger. So I'm going to go ahead and size this up to maybe 90. Or let's try 150. Now that's a nice big 0 that we can see on our screen. And then I'm going to go to the top, and I want to start placing things, excuse me, in the X and Y to move it so it's in the upper right. This is my player 1, it's green, and I want my score for that to be in the upper right where this sort of empty area is. So to do that, I know that my screen space is actually being set to 1920 by 1080, and 1920 is the width size. And so right now, it's being set in the center, and that's halfway to 1920. So if I want it to be close to the edge, it starts at 0 on the left and goes horizontally to the right, which is going to be 1920. But because we're starting at the 0 point, we need half of that. So you would just divide that by 2, and it's going to be like 960. So I want to put this maybe somewhere in X around positive 900. And you see that places it at the right, because that's half of the 1920, and 960 would have been all the way at the edge. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that down a little bit, maybe to 870, and then move it up if 1080 is the tall part of it, and I divide that by 2, we're looking at something around let's say about 500 might be where we want to be. So so that's placing it a little bit close to the edge. I would say maybe 480 would be a little better, or maybe even move it in a little bit like 860. And you can just interactively do that, and you see it moves it in a little bit more. Maybe 850 is exactly where we want it. And then if we want to move it down a little bit, maybe 460 is a good placement for that. So let's say that's where I want it, and I want to then move that over to the other side, or duplicate this because it's correct the way it is. I do want to duplicate it, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And you can just Control D or edit duplicate. And there we have a second one, and I'd want to change the name to player 2 score. It's also going to come up under canvas. So now I got a player 1 and player 2 score. They're sitting right on top of each other. I just want to move it over. So if I'm putting this at 850 and I'm about 100 off in X, I'd probably want to put this at maybe 100. Or sorry, no, negative 850. So Yeah, the center is 0, so that means negative 850. So if the player 1 is at positive 850, then and we're starting in the middle at 0, then that would be negative 850 to place it in the exact same place. And then, just to make it clear who is player 1 and who is player 2, I would color code these for the color of the tank. So therefore, I've placed them on certain sides, but if I were to go around that wall, you might forget who is who. You wouldn't forget if you take player 2 and you go into color and you move that a little bit right. And you might not want to make it bright red because it makes it a little darker, but you might want to give it sort of a red tone, but keep it really light. And then the same thing with the other one. I could go to player 1, click in there, and just bring this over to the green area and make it green toned. And now I know whose score is who, even if we're moving around in different places in this field. Now the last thing I need to do is add to Canvas the score script. So we already looked at that inside of Visual Studio, and we saw that this goes on the Canvas object. So it is looking for a UI object here, and actually down here it's looking for a text object. So I'm going to go ahead and go back in there, and on the Canvas object that I have here, I'm going to add component scripts, and I'm going to choose that score manager. And I do need to plug something into it. It doesn't actually know, putting on the score manager, it doesn't know which one is which until I plug it in. So here's my player 1 score object. I'm going to drag it over. It's looking for a text object, which these are. And then I'll put player 2 where it says player 2 score text. And then it should update based on our health. Let's go ahead and try it. I'll go ahead and hit play. And we'll go ahead and shoot. We can move both of the tanks and so they're facing each other. And let's just go ahead and try shooting with the red one here. We actually knocked that guy over. Let's go and capitalize on that by moving up. I'm just going to knock him right off the playing field, I think, because I need to put some walls in here. But let's go ahead and shoot it one more time and see if the red turns to a 1, and it does. So we know that that's working. We need to add some walls so that it's not going to knock the tanks off our entire field. So it seems to be working. I'm going to do a file save there, and then I want to go ahead and create a 3D object cube. I don't need to put any rigid body or anything on that. I just need the collider that's on it automatically. And I would want to scale it up in a couple of the axes. So I'm going to actually scale it in, let's do the x-axis, and let's put a 50 in there. And so maybe we need a little bit more than that. Let's go to 60. And let's make it maybe 5 tall. And maybe we actually need a little bit taller than that because these things can really fly. So I'm going to make it 10 tall, and we'll move it up until it looks like it's actually sitting close to the ground, which is going to be right around 5 in Y position. And then we'll go ahead and move that to the different parts. Now, if you want to look down on the whole field, you can go click on the y-axis of the global axis, the green one, and it's going to just switch you to sort of an orthographic view from the top. And then I can just drag this to one side here, and I might need to scale it a little bit more, so I can put the scale tool on and just scale it a little bit more if it looks like it needs it. And then we'll go ahead, we can call that, or we can just leave it named cube for now. Or actually, we're going to duplicate it. So I'm going to call it, let's call it Arena Wall 1. And so I'll duplicate that. I'll do a Control D to duplicate it. And if it actually didn't take, let me try it again. Make sure it's selected. And put your cursor in your 3D view, Control D, and there it made a copy of it. W to go to your Move tool, and I'll drag the wall to the other side and place it on the other side here. And then I'm going to need one on the sides as well, so we can just Control D, duplicate again, and I get another arena wall. And let's just rotate it. If you put your rotation tool and you rotate a little bit in Y, you'll see it's positive numbers. We can just type in 90 there, and then we can move it. Put your Move tool on and just move it into place. So I want to move it to the side, and then I'm going to move it in X, and then I might need to scale it a little bit because one of my axes is a little bit longer than the other. So we'll just try to place that kind of close to the middle and go ahead and scale it a little bit. And then once we get that the way we want it, we can just Control D again and move the whole thing to the other side. So then you have an arena, and you might want to select your camera at that point. So here's my camera, and if it's if it is the main cam, you might want to actually call it main cam, because there are certain things inside of Unity that is looking for main cam, and then I might want to just move it a little bit to make sure that I'm not gonna miss any areas of my arena. So maybe move it this way a little bit. And we could switch to our global axis to just move it globally. So there, I'm seeing my whole arena now. So now I could test the game out a little bit more clearly. Now, if you go to your sounds file, you'll see that you have a background sound here, and you might want to go ahead and put that in there to have sort of a soundtrack for your game. I believe we've used all of the other sounds, but we haven't heard the game over sound yet, so we want to try that out. And I'm going to bring in this background sound, it just needs to be on some kind of object in here. So it makes sense to either put it on your canvas object or to put it on your ground plane. I'm going to put it on the canvas object, and I'm just going to add a component to it, audio source. And in that component, I'm just going to put that background sound, and it's going to play automatically. And I want to go to the bottom and it's kind of loud, so I'm going to just pull the volume down on that a little bit to maybe a quarter of what it is, because I want to hear my other sounds. And then I'll go ahead and let's save this again, and let's try playing it. And now we hear the sounds, and we can go ahead and move our tanks around. So here's my right tank, and if I shoot, now, okay, so the music stopped, and it shouldn't stop for a soundtrack like that. It just should keep going. It is a loop. So I forgot to turn on in the audio source, make sure you turn on loop so that it keeps going, because otherwise it's just going to be very noticeable that it automatically turned off. So let's play it again. And here we go. It shouldn't turn off anymore. And I'll go ahead and move my tank, and let's go ahead and try shooting the wall. So I'll hit Control. We'll get rid of that wall. And then I want to move forward a little bit. Let's try the other one, the green tank. So we'll move forward with the green tank, and I'll go ahead and shoot with the left control. And we can see that we got one. Okay, let's keep going with that one. We know that that one works. So let's go ahead and rotate our other tank back, and let's try shooting him back. Okay, we need to get a little closer, so we'll get a little closer, and then we'll shoot again. Okay, we got 1-to-1. All right, so now I'm going to just try out the, I want to get to the final one. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward with my red tank. Let's rotate a little bit, and we'll go ahead and hit Control again. It gives me a 2, 3, 4. What we want to see is if I get to 5, do we get the sound, the wind sound? So let's hit that last one. We got 5. And okay, so we're missing something. It did not end the game, and we didn't get the wind sound. And I got a missing component exception. It says there's no audio source to tank player game object. So that's what we're missing. Let's go ahead and stop it. It's looking for tank player source score. So it's looking for where the win object is. So let's go back again and okay. So when we added the health script to the tanks, there was a lose sound that's plugged in, and it's actually being played from the tank itself. And the tank itself, as you can see, does not have any audio source. So we're going to go back over and find our prefab for our tank. And we're going to go ahead and add component audio source. And it's playing from the script. We don't have to plug anything in. Let's try it again. And let's just go ahead and we'll just use the red tank here, especially since the green tank just got knocked over. I'm also kind of, I want to change that lighting. So go a little bit closer. Okay, there we got 2, 3, 4, and let's try 5. And there we heard the da-da. So that was the wind sound, and you can see that the player 1 tank disappeared, it exploded. And you know, you could do other things instead of just having it have a destroy command. Maybe you want to put another explosion on it. So that would go where the destroy command is. And that would make that tank explode after a few seconds once you get to that 5. You could probably think of other things that you could do for this. I'm going to leave it at this because this is, I think, all they did with the tank tutorial, and I want you to get to this stage. But other things you could do is you could have the wind sound come up and then have the soundtrack turn off, because obviously you don't really need the soundtrack continuing on after the wind sound. You could also have something else come up, like some text that says you win or something like that. We'll do more of that later, but if you can figure out how to do that, go ahead and add that into it. You could also add some obstacles into here, and you'll notice that my lighting is not very good. I had the lighting coming in at the side, so there's a lot of shadows here, and so it would be better for me to go ahead and find my my light, my directional light, and go ahead and rotate it so it's going straight down. If you want to do that easily, I could just put in the rotation 0, 0, 0 so that it's sort of straight, and then I could easily see that I need to rotate it in the x-axis to make it go straight down. And maybe I don't want it straight down. Maybe I want a little bit of rotation on there. Otherwise, it's going to be kind of shiny. And I might want to work on that ground plane anyway, because it does look a little shiny for a ground plane. But I could give it a little shadow maybe on one side, or a couple of different sides there, so that it looks like the sun is kind of above, and you'll get a little bit of shadows underneath the tanks. If the shadows don't have any shadows, or if the tanks don't have any shadows underneath them, or the middle wall here doesn't have anything, then maybe that might not be the greatest for having a 3D point of view. So to finish up, I want to go back and look at the scripts for a second. So we didn't finish looking at all the scripts, and the last script for the scoring I did need to go over. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to Visual Studio. We looked at the current health script, and I wanted to go on to the score manager and look at that in a little more detail. We did create the UI for it, and it is using UnityEngine.ui. And then down here, you're seeing where the text is being put in, so that it knows what's the player 1 and the player 2 text that it needs to update. And then it's also making a couple of private variables. So those are public variables, text variables. And then there's a couple of private variables that are integers for the player 1 score. And those are being set to start at 0. So it's going to start at 0, and then it's going to go up and to 5. And in the case of the start, it's setting the text to 0 as well. So there's two different things going on in this script. The text itself is actually text. So it's not a number per se, it's a piece of text and that is being displayed on your screen. And then the score is a number that's being tracked. And they're actually being done in two different areas here. So the text that is displayed on the screen for the text objects that you're putting in is the dot text. And here it's actually setting that to display a 0 at the beginning. Even though we plugged in 0 anyway, even if we didn't plug in 0, it would start with a 0 there. And then it's going to change those numbers as the score changes. So it's going to, here's where the on-player damage procedure is, and it's taking in the player number, and if the player number is 1, then it's going to add, if the player 1 gets damage, if on player damaged is true, and that's player 1, if the damage coming in is to player 1, then it's going to add to the player 2 score. So adding plus plus, player 2 score plus plus, is like a +1. It adds to it, to player 2. So player 1 gets damage, it adds to player 2. If player 2 gets damage, it adds to player 1. And then it takes that and updates the actual text down here with the score. And it has to do that by running a .toString procedure. And this is something that converts the number to what's called a string. And string is basically characters on the keyboard, it's text. And so that's what is looking for in the text object as an input. So that's how it's updating your score, and that's where the damage is being actually tracked and displayed. So that's pretty much all of the scripts that are making this tank game work. And you can add extra things in here, whatever you want to do to add, say, colors to your tanks, and maybe other walls and things to your player field here, so you can make it more interesting, and to customize it to make it a unique tank game that doesn't look exactly like the tutorial or the one that I showed you today in this video. So make sure that you try to add a little bit of your own artistic take on it. And if you want to try to add something in the code too, you could do that as well.